I know there's been a person asking for a few times. I know we've covered it a lot. But they've got some hair algae, and they have said, we've heard us talk about algae being an imbalance of light and nutrients, but their main question is, how do you start finding out what the problem is? So like, okay, so I know it's an imbalance, and I've got this hair algae. How do you start diagnosing it? I would say the first thing, have your light on a timer. Mm-hmm. Like, make the lighting constant, and if it's not on a timer or have a built-in timer, it's not constant. I don't care if you wake up every day at the same time, go to bed at the same time every day. Eventually you have a late night. Eventually you're gone for the weekend. Like, there's enough variation there that even that can cause the problems. So the first thing, light becomes a constant. That's important.
Light becomes consistent also.
Yes, consistent. It's a known parameter at this point. Like, it's 8 hours a day, or it's 10 hours a day, or whatever it is. Then you kind of start, balancing nutrients. So let's say you make a dose, and then at the end of the week, you're going, I have nothing left. Maybe that's a sign you don't have enough. Or maybe you've got way too much nutrients in there, and it's a sign like, okay, I've got a problem going on where I have excess. So you try to dial that into, in my personal opinion, in a perfect world, my planted tanks would sit at 20 parts per million, like nitrogen, with the matching other nutrients sitting there all the time. For me, I feel like that's super easy mode. Now, that doesn't really happen in aquariums, though, because plants eat, it goes down, you dose, it goes up, and so it's always kind of moving. But if you know that maybe 20 parts per million, like if you're using an easy green, if you monitor the nitrates, you can focus on that and go, what do I got to do to keep it right there? If you're dosing like a PPI method where you're like, or an estimative index where you're flooding the nutrients, and then at the end of the week you're water changing it out, kind of the same thing. If you're sitting at 50, you're going, I probably put too much in. And you would do, probably like a 60% water change. And then I would say, don't add nutrients for that week. That's where I think a lot of people, like with that system, they're like, well, you add nutrients every week no matter what. It's like, well, if you were really high and you 60% water change, you drop down to like 25 parts per million. If you dose again, you're just going straight back up. So you got to use a little bit of detective work of like, here's where I am today. Where do I want to see my tank in 7 days? What happens if I add things to that? What's it actually doing? Because I think a lot of people disassociate, like, plants need fertilizer, so I put fertilizer in, and that makes plants grow. And it's like, well, no. Plants need nitrogen, phosphate, micro, other macros. And so you gotta become a scientist, unfortunately, a little bit. And
that's good.
And let's say those were both in sync. Like that, sometimes that happens, which that's rare with algae, but let's say those are in sync and you're like, I don't get it. The last thing I usually...
Was that Backstreet Boys or In Sync?
What's up? Oh, yeah.
What? Oh, sorry.
The last thing I would look at then is like flow. You could just have like a really stagnant aquarium where you're like, the nutrients actually aren't getting around to the plants. Like you've got this stem plant sucking it up, and then like, geez, that Anubias down the road's like not getting anything because there's such little flow going on.
Yep.
But most people I find are kind of ridiculous on filtration anyway. Like I got 6 canister filters and 9 hang-on backs. So yeah, that's the problem solving. We should make some giant infographic. Like
a big one?
Do you have a timer? No. That's your problem.
Yeah, get a timer.
Yes. Okay. Do you have nitrates at this level? No. Go over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could. That's really what you're doing.
You can do that. I've seen some charts like that, basically.
I mean, that's really what you're doing is kind of just trying to follow down to like, what's the most likely problem?
Yeah, what's the most likely problem, and also, you want to look. Basically, one of the things that you want to look for if you're going just visually looking for something, you would want to get the appearance of what is going on with your plants. Your plants are always a great indicator of what you're either deficient in, or maybe maybe not overly.
There's a couple of them. I think if you have like a crazy amount of magnesium, it'll do something.
Yeah, they'll do some
they get like
stuff
curly or
magnesium.
something. Yeah.
But Well, they'll get super dark, but that's also, you can also, that's a way to diagnose. So like your plants are going to tell you more often than not, and there actually is a pie chart out there that's pretty easy to find. You can just Google search it, but essentially, it's like if my plant is doing X, right? Oh, I'm deficient in Y, which correlates to I don't have enough Z for all three of these to work.
And there's the next level that that I probably don't know.
It's like Farmer's Almanac or something like that has a pie chart that will tell you like which ones react.
Yeah, and over my head is, and you probably know this, which I don't expect you to explain it, but sometimes you could have like all the calcium in the world and you're showing a calcium deficiency, but it can't possibly uptake calcium because you don't have boron, you idiot, you know, or whatever. And it's like that goes on a level that I don't understand. And there's people that definitely know it, but for me, I just know that you can have like, I got unlimited calcium, and yet it looks like it's got a calcium deficiency.
Right.
You're
That's
probably missing something else.
That you want to look up that base. There's a real basic pie chart. I can't tell you exactly where it is. You're gonna probably have to Google search for a minute to find it. And no, I don't have a link with me, but you will find the uptake. Basically, the uptake. It's the sister essentially. So.
It's like a symbiotic thing.
I don't want to list any off the top of my head because I wasn't thinking about this before the show, and I'll just get hammered in the comments if I say the wrong ones. But there's essentially a sister nutrient for each one to allow uptake to go correctly into the plant and be utilized, right? Like here's a perfect example with humans. Here's one I do know. Is that with calcium, you need vitamin A and vitamin D. Vitamin A and D don't normally show up in milk, right? That's why when you go to the grocery store, vitamin A and vitamin D are added to milk in order for you to properly uptake the calcium from milk, right? That's a perfect example. It's like if you could be drinking all that calcium, but if you don't have any A or D vitamin in order to utilize that calcium, your body won't absorb it. It'll just pass through, and then you poop, like regular or irregular. I don't know. You could be lactose, right? You could be. But it's going to be the same thing for plants. Like if, and also one of the things that people have consistently asked, and people are asking even today in the chat, does my low-tech tank need CO2? If I don't have highlights, if I don't have this, if I don't have that. You have to remember that like CO2 is the free-floating form of carbon. Now, there's more than one type. Here comes the ghost. Great.
Yeah.
In the middle of the show, ghost. CO2 is essentially the free-floating form of carbon as opposed to the best way to kind of explain it, the solid form of carbon, right? And that's almost always the building block to build the plant itself, which is why you'll notice now that our environment now is at 400, and I think the last reading I saw was 412 parts per million in the air, which is extremely high. But part of the Earth's response to that is that forests are growing and expanding all over the place. Like there's a ton of area up in Canada that's not supposed to have forests on it, and yet there are the trees because carbon is so much more readily available for the photosynthetic process that trees are growing where they weren't growing before. Like there might not be a great amount of nutrients in the soil or whatever. It's far too long for me to just keep talking about, but that carbon is the building block that allows the plants to be able to utilize things like nitrates or nitrogen or phosphates or whatever to actually build themselves into a plant.
Speaking of,
if you add CO2 to your aquarium, it just adding CO2 to your aquarium doesn't do anything. It just makes it easier for your plants to grow, essentially. Yeah. That would be the best way that I could kind of verbalize it. It's like, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to make your tank super dope in like 5 minutes, right?
No.
It's just going to allow your plants the opportunity, an easier opportunity to be able to grow underwater, which is typically the handicap that plants have, is that they're underwater. There's less CO2 in water. Yeah. Do we remember the parts per million in water?
I think it starts at about 8 parts per million naturally. Right. And if you were like, oh man, I'm at maximum saturation that my fish can live and my plants can live, that's between 28 and 30 parts per million. But I think for most people just most people in general, I don't think they think about CO2 the correct way. I always try to think about it like air in an aquarium, because it's another gas that, like, if you had an aquarium that, like we had an aquarium here and it just had water in it, no filtration, nothing, there will be a level of oxygen and there will be a level of CO2 in that water naturally. Now, if we put a few fish in there, let's say it's a 55 gallon, we have 5 neon tetras, we wouldn't necessarily have to add an air stone or anything like that. Like, it'll allow enough oxygen to exchange at the surface, they'll be fine. If we have 5 Oscars in there, though, at the rate at which they breathe, we will have to add oxygenation in some form to that aquarium. That's the same thing that happens in an aquarium with plants. If you have one Anubias, in that 55 gallon, it will never run out of CO2, essentially.
Uno Nubius?
Yeah, Uno Nubius. It'll never run out of CO2. But if you have a full-on planet tank and they're all using CO2, then it makes sense for us to start injecting CO2 so they don't run out. Just like when we had 5 Oscars, we inject air so they're not running out.
Yeah, and essentially what ends up happening is you have like a fully planted tank. It's like each plant is just like waiting in line.
Mm-hmm.
Like, man, where's that CO2 molecule that I need to combine with? And then they're just waiting. So it's like somebody waiting in the lunch line.
Yep.
It's like, well, you're ready to eat, but you don't have any food yet.
Yep.
You got the tray. You ain't got nothing on it. You just...
Yeah. We haven't fired up the kitchen or anything.
Essentially, your plants end up just waiting in line because they need that CO2 to complete the process. And, yeah.
And that's why CO2 only helps if people were waiting in line.
Right.
Like if you've got a full-on cafeteria and there's no one waiting in line to buy food, installing another cafeteria doesn't make it like, now we're really selling stuff. Like now you just have more stuff you're not selling. And that's the same way in aquarium. So if it needs it, CO2 is super beneficial. If it doesn't need it, that's when you get to people like, I didn't do anything. And that's for a long time. All the planted forums are like, yeah, add CO2, it's magical, then you don't have algae problems. But all the people that were participating in the planted tank forums were super plant nerds with a billion plants in there.
Right.
And then you get a person with like, I've got 6 moss balls and an Anubias. I added CO2, it didn't do anything.